I'm excited for our next speaker. She's coming all the way from Malaysia here to us. Kamales Lardi is managing partner of Lardi and Partner Consulting. She has 18 years of experience in corporate strategy, and in 2017 she was selected for the Women in FinTech Power List by Innovate Finance UK. She's the chairperson of the MBA Advisory Board at Durham University, and today she'll tell us how blockchain technology disrupts business models. I'm excited, I hope you are too. Please help me welcome to the stage Kamales Lardi. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. So what we've been hearing so far in the Blockchain Summit track is quite a lot of information about deep diving into blockchain use cases and the technology aspect of things. So what I'd like to do now is maybe take a step back and zoom out a little bit and have a look at how disruptive technologies actually impact traditional business models, and then look at some of the use cases within, or use cases for blockchain across various industries. And then I'd like to deep dive into two very specific examples of how blockchain impacts business models, one from an enterprise perspective and the other from an overall industry perspective. So let's start from the very beginning, or the very basics. The traditional assumptions and rules around what we understand around what business models are have been completely disrupted. They don't apply anymore, they're not valid anymore. So the time-tested assumptions that we have around how to identify your customers, how to develop and market products and services, and how to operate or manage an organization has been completely rendered invalid due to digital technologies. And we see this through examples such as a very new organization that wants to start up, or any kind of business of any size, is able to extend its reach across industry boundaries, across customer demographics, across physical locations, and basically set itself up as a dominant business model. So traditionally, what you have within an industry, a dominant business model will appear. And a dominant business model is basically the organization or the business model that's able to utilize the resources and capabilities to the best of its ability in the most efficient way. And new business models that appear, or new companies, new startups, find it very difficult to compete with this sort of dominant business models because it has the scale and spread, and it's hard to compete on that level. But what we're seeing today is disruptive technologies such as blockchain are able to give new business models leverage. And they can leverage these new technologies to basically displace traditional business model designs. So one example of this we're seeing is output-based business models. An output-based business model basically means customers are, or businesses that are able to focus on the outcome of a product or service, outcome from using a product or service, rather than the sale of a product or service. So a good example of this is the Amazon Dash replenishment service, where a connected coffee machine can actually make an order for coffee bean supply when the supply is low without human intervention. So this is an example of an outcome-based model. Now with technologies like blockchain, what we're seeing is a shift towards decentralization as well, and decentralization to its truest form, where traditionally a business model is designed or it's developed around the premise or understanding that you have a central, powerful decision-making unit. And what we're seeing today is with blockchain, this central decision-making unit is becoming irrelevant, and you're going towards a more peer-to-peer environment. So obviously, technology is a key driving factor when you start looking at disruption in business models. But technology is not the only thing. Technology does not transform or change an entire industry. So what really is able to change an industry is when you're able to identify a business model that can match the consumer needs or the emerging consumer trends with the capabilities of these new technologies and develop a more compelling value proposition for your customers. This is when it really comes up that you gain a sustainable competitive advantage. Because when you talk about just technology, any organization can go ahead and implement a technology. I think a real sustainable competitive advantage for a business model comes when you're able to do this mix and match of the emerging market needs, consumer trends, with the capabilities of technology. And the possibilities are endless. We're seeing that with the range of new disruptive business models that are coming up these days, right? Business models like the freemium model, which never existed 5 or 10 years ago. So let's look at an example here. Let's take the energy industry as an example. A growing consumer trend or preference in the energy industry, particularly in developing markets, is to have a more decentralized control of energy management or energy supply. And now with things like the Tesla solar panels for the roof, which are becoming more affordable, self-production or self-development of your own energy, self-production of energy basically, is becoming more affordable. Individuals can put up these solar panels and basically start supplying energy for themselves. So Powerledger is a company in Australia that is a blockchain-based company, and they've realized that there is a market here, there is a consumer need here, and they've taken blockchain and smart contracts and developed a P2P or peer-to-peer trading platform to allow people who are generating their own energy to then sell this excess energy to their peers through this trading platform. So this is an example of how a company can develop a business model by matching growing consumer and market trends with capabilities of new technologies. And it's not just about individual technologies as well. You want to also try to identify business models that can utilize maybe several different types of disruptive technologies and leverage on the enabler technologies, which have already been massively adopted across many regions. And so the two examples that I will show you later will demonstrate how this is done a little bit more. So we've heard quite a few definitions of what blockchain is today, so I'm not going to go into too much detail of that, but I'd like to do a very simplistic definition. Blockchain is basically a distributed ledger that is offering us a new way to store information and to share information by a community. So this community now has the capability to have a copy, or the community has a copy of this ledger. Each individual in the community has a copy of this ledger. And all members of the community need to collectively validate and approve any changes or updates to the ledger. The ledger is able to basically record any transaction of value, and all records are searchable, transparent, and permanent. So this is a very simplistic definition of what blockchain is. But what does this all really mean, actually? Blockchain technology creates a completely new premise for trust in the business environment. Now, we, as business people, have spent decades creating a robust business ecosystem that relies on third parties and intermediaries to secure trust for our transactions between one another. So what blockchain does is it takes us to the next level of this decentralized business model where you don't need third-party validation and intermediaries for this trust. You can completely eliminate them and rely on individual transactions. Now let's just take an example of digital business models or new business models like that developed by Uber or Airbnb. Now we're all familiar with these. We've all understood how disruptive these new business models have been to the hotel business or to the transportation business. But those business models claim to be part of the share economy. They claim to be decentralized. But if you really think about them, those business models are not really decentralized because there is still a single entity that owns the platforms and the network. They still charge consumers for using these platforms. Yes, they do provide power to the end consumer to sell and trade products and services directly to each other, but they still own the network where these transactions occur. And they're still vulnerable to regulatory action, right? So if one day this group, for whatever reason, disappears, all the transactions on these platforms will also be subject to disruption. Now, with blockchain technology, it's taking this share economy, this decentralized principle, to its truest form, because it really takes control away from any one central unit and hands it out to individuals. And this is what I think the real value of blockchain is, to be able to understand that we're now moving towards these decentralized business models. And this is where the disruption comes for traditional business models and traditional enterprises and corporations. So what I'd like to cover a little bit here is some of the use cases, and I know you've seen several different examples of this chart. I like this one because it does really illustrate the number of enterprises that are actually exploring blockchain over the last couple of years. And this number has been growing. We are estimating a worldwide spend on blockchain technology to reach 2.1 billion this year alone. And up to last year, we were seeing a lot of exploration projects, a lot of experimentation by corporations. Now we're seeing this leap into proof of concepts going into full deployments, right? One good example was Maersk, which announced its blockchain pilot earlier this year. And they would allow users of their network to basically manage and track the shipment of goods or transport of goods across the globe. And the potential for cost reductions, for efficiency, for speed of tracking these goods across the globe, across the entire value chain, has huge potential for them. And this is a real example that's actually been launched already. We are seeing quite a lot of examples as well in supply chain and financial services, but I think the real potential of blockchain comes, there could be real potential for blockchain across every single industry. So this is, I think, one of the key questions that I like to tell clients when I work with them to try and identify business models for blockchain, is to look at how and when it can be applied in your enterprise or organization. This is a key question which I think a lot of times we forget to ask, because there is such a focus on implementing the technology that we forget to step back and think about the fact that it's actually developing and maturing as we speak. It's not reached full maturity yet. So this is a framework developed by Harvard that analyzes use cases for blockchain implementation. And it looks at the use cases across two different axes. The level of novelty speaks to how new or innovative the blockchain application is, how different it is from whatever business model exists today. And the level of complexity speaks to how well it can integrate into your existing business environment. At the very bottom, you have the single use, and those are use cases that really relate to implementing blockchain to replace a current process or function. So a good example would be to use blockchain for cross-border payments, which basically can simplify the process, speed it up, and make it a lot cheaper as well. So the localization use cases in that quadrant, most of the use cases are related to implementing blockchain within a closed-loop environment with a select number of users. The substitute quadrant really speaks to use cases that are able to disrupt an entire function or replace an entire function within an organization. And finally, transformative use cases disrupt an entire industry, right? So when we look at these types of use cases, I think it's very, very important for us to look at how you can apply blockchain within your organization. And I know you've seen several different kinds of decision maps already this afternoon. So this is the one that I typically apply when I speak to clients. Really looking at 4 main categories of information or criteria that help us decide, do we really need blockchain in our business environment? Now this is a really, for me, sometimes it's a really funny discussion. I recently had a financial services client who asked me, can you develop a use case, or can you develop a business case assessment to compare implementation of a centralized database versus blockchain? Now, obviously this is comparing apples to oranges. It's completely 2 different things, and I think if you're looking to implement blockchain to replace a central database, then you're probably looking at it from the wrong perspective. The other thing is, when you look at creating a business case for blockchain, it's quite challenging because you can't create this traditional Excel sheet that defines what blockchain technology is, right? You can't define the financial returns because the precedent on using and applying blockchain technology is just simply not there. The success cases or the financial returns, we don't have that. The nature of these projects are experimentation projects. So the best way you can do this is really look at these criteria and see, does this apply within my business environment, and how can I apply this, how can I experiment or explore this technology? And then you have also quite strong drawbacks to consider when you look at blockchain implementation. So they don't have a standard protocol, and I think you've seen several different kind of as-a-service blockchain platforms being presented to you today by IBM, SAP, and so on. And once we have this standard protocol, I think the technology will take off into mass implementation or adoption. But for the moment, we're still very much at this sort of developing phase. The other thing is the high costs and low throughput or latency. And we also have to consider that the true value of blockchain comes when you implement it across an entire value chain from end to end. Implementing it within one functional area or one network environment will not bring you the true value that you can obtain from blockchain. So I thought it would be interesting to share with you 2 examples that I'm working on at the moment. The first is a vehicle aftermarket service example. So when we look at developing business models for blockchain, or how blockchain could impact a business model, a traditional business model, the first thing we always do is to catalog the existing business environment. And this is really looking at it not from a technology perspective, but looking at it from a business process environment perspective or a business strategy perspective. So cataloging the process environment, cataloging the key stakeholders and players involved in the process, and how they interact with each other. And most importantly, defining what the key challenges are in this current environment. So here we have the vehicle aftermarket services environment, which is basically spare parts for cars. And we have millions of dollars spent across the globe manufacturing spare parts for cars and then storing them in warehouses. And storing them without knowing for sure at which point you're going to actually need these spare parts, or how quickly you're going to use them. So they're sometimes even stored indefinitely. This whole process is also quite distant from your customer environment. The customer could take up to 2 to 3 weeks to actually receive a spare part that they've ordered. And this entire process is then heavily reliant on intermediaries like the manufacturer, as well as the distribution channels. And so when we look at a business model like this, one of the key things we want to keep in mind is that you have your customer problem at the center of your business model. And within this, we can apply new technologies to transform the way you operate. And here we are looking at not just blockchain, but the combination of several different kinds of technologies to offer the greatest value for your customer. And so what we're doing here is really combining 3D printing, blockchain technology, Internet of Things, and sensor technology to create an on-demand fabrication model. And so what happens here is, instead of manufacturers manufacturing or producing these spare parts, you're actually getting the car designers to basically design the spare part 3D print models and upload that on the blockchain. Once that's on the blockchain, you can allow different stakeholders, you can offer permission to different stakeholders, like a localized 3D print warehouse, to access and print these models on demand whenever a workshop or an end user requires it. And so this actually creates quite an efficient market that's fairly quickly going to be able to produce on demand whatever spare parts are required. And you can also manage the security or the designs of these spare parts, because with the blockchain you can manage, you have identity management to allow different stakeholders to access these designs. Another example is in the palm oil supply chain industry. Now, I don't know how many people are actually able to how many are following kind of the palm oil industry developments in Europe, or the biofuel industry developments. So this is actually something I'm working on now with the Malaysian Palm Oil Council in Europe. The European Parliament has actually voted to ban palm oil biofuels in Europe as of 2021. And this has a significant impact on the Asian palm oil production industry, because they've got millions of dollars worth of palm oil production embedded in the supply chain. So Malaysia and Indonesia are actually the biggest producers of palm oil. And so what we're doing is actually trying to identify the use of new technology within these areas. And the first thing we did was to identify the current challenges within the palm oil industry. And if you think about it, the key concerns in Europe relates to the fact that the current supply chain has challenges with deforestation. There's a question around deforestation. There are environmental risks, human rights violations, and so on. So there's a big question around sustainability of the supply chain. And of course, there are also challenges with spoilage and contamination when the goods are being transferred and so on. So what we did was we cataloged this environment, and then we looked at use of blockchain for the palm oil supply chain industry. And what this does is basically look at using the combination of blockchain and sensor technology and mobile devices to basically identify plantations in Asia that are sustainable, and then to be able to distribute to them the RFID chips that can be actually embedded on the trees or on the palm oil seeds that are actually being produced. And this can automatically upload data about the location of the plantation, the time that it's being plucked, the owner of the plantation, the number of workers, and so on. All this information can be automatically uploaded onto the blockchain. And once it's uploaded, with these tags, it can be tracked all through the entire supply chain, from the mills to the refineries to the manufacturers, right up to the end customer. And this allows a customer in Europe, for example, to walk into a store and using the barcode on the product and his mobile device to check where this palm oil supply has come from, the source plantation, basically. So this gives the end-to-end credibility and sustainable supply chain that normally wouldn't exist. And what's interesting is the certification of palm oil sustainability actually already exists today. It's based on traditional technologies where you have to enter data along the supply chain to show where the source of this palm oil comes. The value of blockchain comes when you are able to replace that process, because that process is subject to human error, it's subject to malicious acts, it's subject to manual processes where you can actually make mistakes. And with blockchain, you minimize the number of human intervention points, and you're able to actually trust the single source of data. And what's also interesting is the regulators don't have to, today they currently check every part of the supply chain, and it reduces the burden on them because you can then check on only certain touch points or very specific touch points within the value chain. And this reduces the burden or the necessary requirements for human intervention. So this creates a far more, I think, sustainable supply chain. The big challenge of implementing something like this, there are so many stakeholders involved, and I think you've also heard a few of these challenges with the previous presentations. There are so many stakeholders involved, so many people that you have to shift towards using a new technology environment. The existing technology or business architecture within this industry is also quite traditional. And so this is a major shift, and this kind of shift doesn't happen overnight. It probably will take a few years before the stakeholders are convinced and bought over, and they're able to then apply this technology to its fullest. And the real value will be shown once the end-to-end supply chain can be applied. But once that's done, and over the next couple of years, there's a potential to actually demonstrate the real sustainable value of the supply chain. So, how many of you are probably thinking of applying blockchain, or you're already working on blockchain projects? The first thing, and I think a lot of times corporations forget about this, the first thing you need to do is identify your current business environment, and that involves really looking at cataloging your current business processes. It could be an entire functional area, it could be your end-to-end business, however much capabilities or resources you have to basically record or catalog your current business environment, and then defining specific problem areas. And then looking at the most important thing, looking at understanding blockchain technology. Today you have so many as-a-service platforms available, like IBM Hyperledger and Amazon and so on, that allows you access to go into these test environments, these sandbox environments, to learn how blockchain works. And for me, that was a defining moment where I had to actually go, and I'm certified as a blockchain developer for IBM. And I had to do this because the technology is so different and it's so interesting, but it has this huge potential to transform industries. And I think you really understand the potential when you start developing on the platform. So once you have this understanding of the technology and understanding of the business problem, that's when you can match the two and see, is blockchain the right solution for the problem that I'm having, and can I implement it realistically within my environment? And that's when you start to identify use cases within your business environment and start building proof of concepts. And the key element here is step number 5, to look at aligning your stakeholders and integrating it within your existing platform. So I have a lot of contacts within the financial services industry in Switzerland, and they are actually exploring blockchain technology outside of their current business environment, because many banks actually have technology architectures that are probably 20 or 30 years old, and it's very difficult to integrate these environments. So looking realistically at how you can apply blockchain and how you can integrate your current business environment with the new technology. At the end of the day, you want to have something that can be commercialized and can be made into a real business. And then finally, looking at scaling and implementing your solution. I really believe that blockchain technology has quite a lot of strong potential within the various industries, and I think by applying it in the right way and starting exploration at this point, you really can try to understand the potential that you're going to find within blockchain technology. So I'm really excited about seeing where it heads in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming up and inspiring us. Thank you.